Kent is here. He's one of our Canadian friends to talk about the Cynefin model and talk about complex problems. Kent, you want to do a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. So thanks everybody for coming out. Just so everybody knows for this session, the way I prefer it is real-time feedback. So as I'm going through any of this content, feel free to just, unmute, ask a question, post something in the chat if you want to, and we can dive into a conversation. It's not meant to really be me just talking this whole time. Like I'm going to introduce concepts, introduce some of the history, and it's really more for you guys to learn. So make sure you're asking questions, all that kind of stuff. A little bit about my background. So when I was quite young, I realized that there was this gap between people coming up with good ideas and those ideas actually benefiting humanity, right? So all of us have great ideas, and all of us think these amazing thoughts, invent these amazing products, or solve some very hard problems, and then we kind of just forget about it and they go to the wayside, or we might try to implement it, or talk about it, but it never really makes it anywhere. And then we find out 100 years later that this person solved a problem that everybody's having today. um, so that's kind of where I focus myself. So I went to school for that. My whole career has been on trying to solve, how do we solve this gap. And that's how I came across Cynefin and came across some of these other concepts, because it really helps to bridge that gap. Before I get into Cynefin, I want to talk a little bit about the history of where these concepts come from. And really, when you think about it, where does the concept of Agile and Scrum and all this stuff actually comes from? And I want to introduce two different types of thinking. So most people don't think about thinking that much. Most people don't realize that there isn't just one type of thinking. We actually have multiple types of thinking, and one of them is actually fairly new. We didn't actually really understand it until relatively recently. About 1950s is when it came about. So I'll try to draw the picture of these two types of thinking. So the first type, the one that most of us know about, most of us think of as thinking, is this mechanistic thinking. And basically what that means is where the scientific paradigm has been focused on for the last, 400, 700 years, give or take. And that's basically this idea that if you break something down small enough into its smallest parts, you can understand what that thing is. And this type of thinking has been prevalent. It's how we figured out there's atoms. It's how we've broken apart. It's the predominant theory that has been used around the world to really understand what happens. And it actually brought us the Industrial Revolution. So we have a lot of the cool things we have today, washing machines, fridges, that kind of stuff, because of this mechanistic thinking. And if we think back, mechanistic thinking is actually where we have our classical theory of management. So we think our theory of management, the way most organizations have run in the past, is actually quite old, but it actually comes about 1850s is when that actually originated. This idea of manager, like the term actually manager actually comes from around that. This idea of breaking down into assembly line parts, that's only about 1850, and that was the term used for that was scientific management, or scientific management, scientific working. We broke down parts, and if we just reduce the amount that people need to move, if we break down this project into enough subtasks, we should be able to get it done effectively. But what happened around 1850, when we really got into the heart of the Industrial Revolution, is we started to realize that it wasn't, some of our assumptions weren't actually true. We can't actually understand something by breaking it down into smaller and smaller parts. A lot of it was originates from cause and effect. So if you've ever heard cause and effect, that's what it is A causes B, and the continuation of that. But with the breakdown of that type of thinking, starting in about the 1850s, a new type of thinking had to originate. And it didn't actually come into effect really until the 1930s, the 1940s, really coming into its own in the 1950s, was this different way of thinking called systems thinking, or systematic thinking. And it actually originates, this is an interesting story if you delve into it. It actually originates because of quantum physics. So in quantum physics, we identified that you can't actually break things down into smaller and smaller components. There's, oh, the name just slipped my mind. There's an uncertainty principle that exists if you go too far down. And
Heisenberg.
the Heisenberg, thank you. Yeah, that name just slipped my mind. So that because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, we realized that some of the assumptions that we've had about scientific thought for hundreds of years wasn't actually true. And so we started to look at a different way of understanding the universe. And from that, systems thinking really started to develop. And it actually originates from a multidisciplinary group of people who got together and tried to understand how their different ways of viewing the world, the different parts that they had broken down, actually were all related to each other, and trying to develop this common language between it. Systems thinking is the predominant name for it. It's the one that really has gained the most traction. It was used predominantly for business. Like it came out through business. In other circles, the term is actually cybernetics, which I'll get into in a different time. But most people, they use those two terms interchangeably, and right now the vogue is systems thinking. Systems thinking is more about now understanding why things happen. So mechanistic was very much about breaking down, what is the thing, breaking it down smaller and smaller into its pieces. Systems thinking is understand why does something work the way that it works, and how do things interconnect and interrelate to each other. So not so much looking at individual pieces, but how do those pieces now connect and become something bigger than themselves. If you've ever heard of the term emergence, which is starting to become more popular, that actually comes from this systems thinking. It's the properties that emerge from a bunch of different parts working together. And so when you think about systems thinking, it's really thinking the small part out. So how do these things interconnect into their larger environment? First, mechanistic is trying to break things down smaller and smaller into the different pieces. So with these two types of thinking, we now have these two types of thinking. So we have what was traditionally called chaos, which is this more systems thinking, how things work in a chaotic nature, and order. For some reason, this screen isn't following along. I think you might, Christopher, you might need to follow me again. So that was kind of at the start of it, these two types of thinking. And chaos, it's a mathematical term. It comes from chaos theory. And order is just the opposite of chaos. But what we actually started to realize after a while is chaos wasn't really one type of problem. There's actually two types of problems in chaos. So there's the chaotic nature of a pendulum with two joints on it, and you can't actually predict where it goes. And given just a small change in the initial conditions, it can end up in wildly different areas. Whereas complex is more you can understand the problem and you can figure it out. It's just a really big problem and there's a lot of moving parts. Yeah, like Dean said, make sure you're interrupting me because I'm walking through the history and the science. So if I'm getting lost anywhere, I know this like the back of my hand, so I want to make sure that I'm explaining it well. So chaos got broken apart into these two parts, complex and chaotic. So complex is more, it's a really big problem, lots of moving parts, but you can kind of understand it if you work on it long enough. Chaotic is going to be almost impossible to understand because even the smallest change at the start is going to make widely different things happen at the end. What started to happen here, and where Cynefin starts to come in, is Cynefin's a relatively new way of looking at this problem space, but it's basically this problem space, like I said, has existed since at least the 1950s, if not more, where we've really started to understand it. This is just a repackaging and an understanding, and really with the idea to make sure that more of us are actually understanding that there is this different types of thinking, that there are these different types of problems out here, so we can better understand the world around us. So it looks like you're not following me again, Christopher. So where Cynefin starts to come in is what Cynefin did is it broke apart that ordered domain into two different types of problems, complicated and obvious. What's complicated being you can understand it if you're an expert, like if you've worked in the field, you understand the problem. It's a well understood problem. It's It's an ordered. There's a solution you can get to. Obvious is, you write it on a piece of paper and anybody who reads the paper can do it, right? Sending out an email is an obvious thing. Anybody can just do it if you have the directions. He also introduced a fifth domain called disorder. And the reason for that is to help us understand that for the most part, we actually don't understand what types of problems we're trying to solve. And so for most of our life, we exist in this disorder. And it's because we haven't identified what type of problem space we're actually in at this point. So are we in a chaotic? Are we in a complex? Are we complicated? Or are we obvious? So that brings us to the Cynefin framework. So when we look at the Cynefin framework, this is basically what it looks like. And I'm going to try to use an example, a story here to illustrate what the different problem spaces are. So obvious is walking around a racetrack. So if you've ever gone out to exercise and you've seen those racetracks out there, if you used to work in track and field, you run around the track, right? And you run around it. There's one direction you're supposed to go around it, and when you get around, you can choose to run around it again, or you don't, right? It's not that hard of a problem, right? You just put one foot in front of the other and walk around it. Complicated, on the other hand, is more like walking around a city. So complicated, if you've never been to a city before, you trying to get from point A to point B, it's very difficult. It's very complicated. You're not quite sure which way to go. But if you ask a local or if you get a map, you can kind of figure out how to get from point A to point B. And then if you start doing that enough, if you're in that city long enough and you go from point A to point B long enough, it's not really a complicated problem anymore. It starts to transition down into the obvious. And if I'm trying to get down to my local corner store, I know exactly how to do it, right? It's not a complicated problem anymore. It's an obvious. A lot of times what you see because of that, and because it comes from just a one type of problem space, which is the ordered, that there's that transition from complicated to obvious. As you do things long enough in the ordered domain, it just becomes obvious to you. The next type of problem, the complex. So complex is like being dropped off in the woods in a thick fog. So you're in the woods, some parts of it you can kind of understand, that you need to walk in a direction. You're not quite sure which direction you need to go to. You can't see too far because the fog is set into the woods. And basically what you need to do is you need to start walking. You need to start taking a few steps forward, listening, hearing, seeing what's out there, and trying to really understand what is going on out in the world. And then you take a few more steps forward and reassess, and take a few more steps forward and reassess. And that's how you walk in a forest with a thick fog, with the goal of eventually finding your destination. Where is it that you're trying to get to? The last, chaotic. Chaotic is like trying to walk in an earthquake. Basically, you don't walk in an earthquake. You stop walking, you duck under cover, you get under something strong, you lay down on the ground, try to get out out of harm's way. There isn't really the concept of walking anymore in chaotic, right? So when an earthquake's happening, don't be trying to walk down to your corner store. That's not even the goal anymore. There's a completely different change in how you view the world. So when you're looking at it, so this is a little bit more. Oh, I see this. The border for this has gone crazy. Whatever. So when you're looking at this is what it means. And when the Cynefin was put together, you kind of put these different things in there to kind of better help us understand what to do in any one of these spaces. So if you look at complex, complex has probe, sense, respond. That's kind of the actions you should be taking in the complex domain in order to solve a complex problem. So as you walk into the woods, you take a step forward, you probe, okay, what is new around me? What do I see now? What do I hear now? You sense that out. So what does that mean for what I should do? Oh, it looks like this area here is over a little bit clearer. And then you respond. You walk over to the more clear area. Whereas complicated, it's sense, analyze, respond. So you take what kind of problem is this? You analyze it. Okay, it's this type of problem. If it's this type of problem, I know I need to do all this kind of stuff. And then you respond and you do it. Obvious is you sense, okay, it's this type of problem. okay, it's this one, and you just do it. So that's kind of the difference. In chaotic's a little bit different. You act first. So in a chaotic environment, you can't wait for information, because if you wait for information, you might be dead. So if you're in an earthquake and you're standing there and you're trying to probe and sense your environment, and at that time the roof is collapsing on you, well, that's not the best. The first thing you do is you duck underneath a desk, you duck into a sturdy place, and you sense, am I safe here? And then if you are, you stay under there. If not, you try to find a safer place. It also gives you some what's known as constraints and practices, and that's to help you better understand which type of environment you're in. So constraints are limitations on what you can do within a system, and practices is how you determine what is the best thing to do in a system, or what is it that you should do within that type of system, within that type of problem. And where we often actually make mistakes as companies or as leaders or as people in the industry is we apply the wrong type of practices or the wrong type of constraints to the wrong type of problem space. And what you'll actually see in a lot of companies where they make a problem and where they end up getting into trouble is they try to apply governing or best practices into complex problem space. And it actually limits what they're actually capable of doing, limiting the thought that they can have in an organization that ends up getting them into a lot of trouble. So I'm gonna take a step back here. I'm gonna go back to this mechanistic and systemic thinking. And I want to introduce another topic. So how do you tell whether or not you're in mechanistic thinking or systems thinking? So when you're in a more of a mechanistic thinking, you're more focused on the events, right? The breaking down into smaller parts. Systemic thinking is actually trying to understand the mental models about why things are happening. So there's this pyramid. It's actually not supposed to be a pyramid. It's supposed to be an iceberg. So that's why the picture in the top right. So think of it more of an iceberg. And events is that little bit of the iceberg that kind of sticks over the surface, right? We see events, where on a daily basis, we see Joe does something, right? And that's the event, right? Joe causes a bug to happen. Joe does something bad. And some of the times we can start to see the patterns underneath. So does Joe repeatedly cause bugs in our system? Or is this just a one-off, right? What is the overall pattern? And if you're very mechanistic thinking, if Joe causes a bug, you're immediately going to go, Joe, you're in trouble. It's time for you to leave the company. You're not a good employee. If you start to be a little bit more systemic, you say, oh, this is a one-time thing. It should be fine. Where we start to get more into systems, the next is the structures. So this one is more, what is causing Joe to cause these bugs, right? Is he not getting the proper training? Is he not being supported? Is he stressed? Is there things at his home that is causing him to be absent-minded? Are we not giving it proper information, right? So those are now those underlying structures. What are the structures we've actually built that are causing the patterns of behavior that we're seeing? And then the last is the mental models. And this one's a little bit harder to wrap your head around. An analogy that I was heard is, if you think about fish, so fish could talk, what are they talking about? And you can be damn sure it's not water. So mental models is the thing that exists around us. It's the thing that exists within us that we can't actually comprehend because it's how we view the world. So fish and water is just what is, right? It's the thing that's around them. It's the same with us and air, right? We're not talking about, oh, look at the air around us. It sure is airy today, right? We don't really notice it because it's just the thing that is around us. And that's what mental models are. So when you get really deep into systems thinking, it's about challenging your beliefs on how you view the world. For the most part, we sit around structures. If you get really into systems, and we can play with structures, and as high level leaders, you're playing with the underlying structures. How do people interact? As agilists, it's actually our job to play with these structures. So if you think about us building teams is a new type of structure to produce different patterns of events, right? If you think about really getting into Agile, it's about changing people's underlying mental models about how they view the world of work and how they view interactions and how we view getting work done, so that we can change the structures to change the patterns of events. How this plays into Cynefin is it kind of maps nicely around the Cynefin framework, um, and on what is changing. So if mental models are changing, you're usually seeing something a little bit more chaotic. If structures are changing, you're seeing things a little bit more complex. It usually is in the complex area. If events are changing, it's more complicated. You know, you're training experts, things like that. And if you're looking at the events, it's more of an obvious problem. So if an event is happening, it's, well, if this event's happening and I just try to affect that event, I'm not actually affecting the underlying structures. It's more of an obvious type of problem. The last part I haven't talked about is this area of complacency. In this area of complacency, you see that red circle. What that's about is um, if we start to believe our own lies, and if we stop changing our mental models and our structures, and we stop trying to improve and just kind of do work and complete work, what can happen is you can enter an area of complacency where there's a nice little cliff that if your mental models aren't being assessed, you can eventually fall off if there's something that causes those mental models to be changed. So an example of that recently is COVID. COVID caused our underlying mental models to have to change. We had to respond accordingly. And really the underlying thing that changed is our stores can be open. And then all of a sudden, no, they can't, right? We already had this underlying mental model that our stores will always be able to be open. There's nothing that will cause our stores to have to close. And then all of a sudden we had stores that had to start to close and people couldn't go into stores. And we had to respond accordingly to figure things out. Another example, and this is the one that Dean has been asking me to tell this entire time in his head. When are we going to get to the story? A good example of this actually is the retail apocalypse. So if we think back to the retail apocalypse, what had actually started was there was a company out there that was working in the complex domain, and the complex domain that we're trying to solve is how do we create an impossible store online? Like how do we create this online shopping experience? And they've started with trying to create the impossible store of books, right? So there was millions of books out there, and you couldn't actually have a bookstore with all of these books in the store. It would have been, you know, the Library of Babel, where there's that thing would have been huge. You wouldn't have been able to even find books in it, and there's no way you could have kept book stocks because there's millions and millions of volumes of books. But you can do that online, right? You can have an online bookstore with millions and millions of books because it's easier to search, it's easier to have. You don't actually have to have a bunch of physical locations with all of these books. And then there's complex problems that come from that. How do we distribute these books? How do we get them to people effectively? And all of these types of problems. And what happened is they actually started to work in this complex domain and they solved the complex problem of how do you create the impossible store online? How do you create a store online that actually replicates the experience in store? Well, that was happening. The retail industry was in their obvious problem of we know exactly how to make money in retail. All you need to do is open a new store. And if you open up a new store, you're going to make X amount of money, right? We even have spreadsheets that say if we plug in the demographics, the number of people, we know exactly how much money we're going to make month over month in that store. It's just a known problem. We know exactly what it's going to be. And if you look at that time, so this is the late 80s, the 90s, early 2000s, most retail companies, whenever they were talked about, it was about how many new stores they've opened up. Macy's has opened up these many new stores. You know, Eaton's has opened up this many new stores. They're the giants, the juggernauts of retail because of how many stores they have and how much they're able to open up stores effectively and get people to come into their stores. And that was all the retail industry was about. But while that was happening, you had this other company, you know, Amazon, chipping away at this complex problem, and people were starting to take notice. And then all of a sudden, all of those companies that were in their obvious area of, you know, we just need to open up more new stores, their mental models fell away from underneath them, and they fell off of their obvious problem space into the chaotic domain. The thing about chaos in the chaotic domain is it's very expensive, and lots of people don't make it out of it, right? Lots of companies don't make it out of it. So when those underlying mental models about what it meant to be a successful retailer fell away, all of these companies fell off, Best Buy being one of them. And it only was through strong leadership, the acting that we had, moving us back into a complex problem solving space, which is why the Best Buy even talks about Agile these days, that we were able to survive. We had to move out quite quickly. So with that, one thing to keep in mind is, as a company, we kind of need to make sure we're in the solving complex problems as much as possible. So if we drift too much into believing our own lies about, we solve a complex problem, it moves into the complicated space. And if we start to build all of our systems off of the complicated problems we have, the complex problems we solved, we're going to start to slowly shift into an obvious problem solving space where it's just about setting up our systems. This employee just needs to do this paperwork and we're going to be fine. But if we do that as an organization, we're eventually going to fall off into chaos again. All problems go through the cycle, moving around. So somebody solves the complex problem, moves into the complicated space where experts can teach it out. As enough experts teach it out, it becomes obvious to everybody. It just becomes part of the underlying understanding that we all have. And then if that underlying understanding changes, we all fall off into chaos again. The interesting thing about this, so if we think about Agile in and of itself, Agile and the concept of scrums, it's actually no longer in the complex problem solving space. It's actually moving from the complicated into the obvious. And so we're starting to see that, and it's kind of a lot of our jobs is to teach people about Agile and make people understand Agile. There's actually new companies these days that it's just built into their underlying DNA, right? It's just part of the mental models, and they don't have Agile coaches going in because, well, they just understand, oh, of course that's how you do it. That's the water that surrounds us. Why would you do work any other way? Another part of the history I wanted to go to and show you about. So I mentioned cybernetics, and cybernetics is where a lot of the stuff actually comes from, originates from. So systems thinking, cybernetics, they kind of started to develop at the same time, but cybernetics was slightly first. And cybernetics, after this understanding of systemic problems or systems thinking, tried to understand how do you control or how do you steer complex problem solving. So how do we actually solve complex problems? So cybernetics or Kubernetes is actually a Greek term for a steersman. So it helps illustrate what they're trying to do is steering. So if you're in a boat or if you're in a sailboat and you're trying to get from point A to point B, it's not a straight line. Winds and tides and waves are going to knock you off course, and you need to be able to figure out how to change. So this is where the concept of control systems came in, and the concept of feedback. So this term we use, feedback, actually all comes from cybernetics. It wasn't really a term before cybernetics. We as Agilists use it all the time, this term feedback, but actually comes from this probe, sense, respond, right? You probe the problem, you see what happens on your output, you sense by changing what it is that you're going to do about changing that, and then you respond. So you put it back into your input and go through. Where this actually comes from, so the history of a lot of this is the Deming cycle, or if you guys know of Deming, he's an old systems thinker before there's systems thinking, as well as Russell Acroft. They're kind of the fathers of systems thinking. They created this Deming cycle, which is act, plan, do, check, which is basically probe, sense, respond, but better well laid out. And what happened with the interaction of these control systems and the interaction of these problem spaces and how these problem spaces affect our reality, that's actually where we get Agile and Scrum and daily plannings and improvements and design thinking and XP and all of these concepts. They actually originate from this original separation of mechanistic and systemic thinking, and this understanding of our problem spaces and the way we view the world is slightly different.
Hey, Kent, if I can jump in for a second. Nicole added a comment, and I won't read the whole thing. Maybe if you can just jump into comments, but she was asking about the teams and getting specific about what teams mean. I think in the first place, Scrum folks go is teams are made of never-changing set of 7 people plus or minus 2 with end-to-end ownership of a product, etc. Say a little more about teams. Yeah, go ahead.
It's more just kind of a comment and to surface up the 4 rules of a team. I think one thing here in the US that we struggle a lot with, and just as we are changing and shifting, I just wanted to make sure that when Kent talks about teams, that definition of teams is more palpable, because I think here in the US we're not quite to the same level of definition. So there's less question there, Kent, though of course I'd love if you wanted to talk about that, more of a share than anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one thing to think about. So reason why I wanted to talk about this, is my first introduction to, hi, I'm Kent, and here's what I'm going to talk to you about, is when we look at a lot of these problems, they're actually not difficult. What's happening is we're actually starting to believe our own lies. We're reading things, and we're trying to move what should be a complex problem solving into obvious and complicated, or as Nicole pointed out, it's now called clear. That's just a branding thing. So there's 3 C's instead of not, but whatever you want to call it is fine. So that understanding. So if you think about a team, there's a lot of literature out there that tells you, teams should never change and teams should always remain static. And if a person's on the team, they're on that team until the day they die. But that's not really a complex problem. We have to think about what is it that we're trying to achieve in our era. What is the purpose we're trying to get to? And we need to remember, what has come before us and some of the problems that have been solved out there, but it's not necessarily the truth. So up in Canada, we use these 4 rules of a team, and by stating these 4 rules, I've moved this problem into the complicated, and maybe these rules aren't correct, and maybe we'll need to change them at some point in the future. But the 4 rules are: the team has a purpose, which that's true. It's to keep us in the complex domain. To have a purpose, you need to know when you're dropped off in the woods, what it is you're trying to achieve. If you're in the woods, are you trying to build a house, or are you trying to get out of the woods, right? Those are 2 very different types of purposes, and they result in 2 very different types of actions going forward. The next is you have real-time skills, real-time access to all the skills you need. So if you're trying to build a house, well, you need somebody who can do carpeting, you need somebody who can cut down trees, you need somebody who can put it together. If you're trying to get out of the woods, well, you probably want somebody who knows how the woods works, probably can set up a tent or a camp as you go, those types of things. So real-time access to the skills you need. The next is everyone is needed. So if you're creating a team, you need to make sure that everyone is needed in the team. If there's somebody who's not needed, they can leave. Like, you don't need them around to help you solve your purpose, so they can go off. And then the last is win and lose as a team. So if everybody's working towards the purpose, if everybody's success is going to be measured the same in order to achieve that purpose, well, then you probably more have yourself a team. And it is fine for the third one. Everyone is needed. If somebody's not needed right now, but they are going to be needed tomorrow, well, maybe then at that point they're helping win and lose as a team. They're helping the other people on the team do some stuff. They're learning new skills. They're improving their own skills in order to make sure that the whole team is successful.
Right. We have about 5 minutes left. I wanted to maybe give the next 5 just to some Q&A. Anybody have questions for Kent on what he's covered so far? Anybody want to thank Kent for what he's covered so far?
Thanks, Kent.
Hi, this is Asim. I actually did have a question, and thank you, Ken. This was very informing. Could you maybe elaborate on an example of enabling a constraint in the complex space versus governing constraints in a complicated space?
Okay. So an enabling constraint, I'm going to say the visualization first, and then I'll give an example. So the visualization of an enabling constraint is you're free to go anywhere in this direction, just don't go into like stay away from the dark woods. So there's tons of space for you to go. But you know, this is, if you go this area, you're probably going to hurt yourself, right? You're probably going to be unsafe. A governing constraint is more about stay within inside this box, right? So you want to be inside this fence line, you want to be inside this box. If you leave this box, you're in trouble. So enabling is about pushing you in a good direction and making sure that you can, you know, find a bunch of things and find your own area, versus governing is kind of locking you into a box. An example of that is, so governing constraint could be, you're free to do whatever you need to do as long as you stay within budget, right? So whatever it takes to create your purpose, as long as you stay within budget, you're fine, right? Whereas a governing constraint is, if you build anything, it needs to be in the cloud, right? So you're not free in that case to, you know, look at different options or maybe even build the thing that's after the cloud. You have to build your thing in the cloud. So it's kind of, when you're trying to visualize it, is it kind of like a cone where you're free to go anywhere and that cone is endless? Is it an infinite kind of open space that you can explore? Or is it kind of a closed in box?
Got it. So is it safe to say that you may have to go through an enablement step to actually find where your space lies, so you can, once you have that space identified, then it's more of kind of that governing aspect. We've defined what our space is, so now these are areas of availability to kind of move forward. Is that? Or are they kind of two separate things?
They are two separate things. So another visual that might help is it infinite or is it finite? So if it's enabling, it's an infinite possibility. Governing is finite. There's only a limited number of options that you can choose, right? So if that helps. It's kind of like, if you picture, it's like looking out over the horizon. You know, if you look out over the horizon, you can keep walking over the horizon and keep going and going and going. And it's infinite in nature, whereas being in a box in a room, there's only a certain number of places you can be and things you can sit on.
Thanks, that makes sense.
I actually have well, it might be more of a comment than a question, but before I get there, I just wanted to highlight a couple things that came up in chat. Kent did add a bunch of additional resources on the Miro board, so if you're looking for additional videos to watch, it looks like you also copied the Harvard Business article that Nicole had sent in the Agile community yesterday there, so that's there to read as well. And I think, Nicole, you have some resources as well. I think you added in the Agile community yesterday. So if you're looking for more information, oh, sorry, go ahead, Nicole.
Oh yeah, I think they're all the same ones. I know we tend to go back to the same sources.
Right.
But yep.
Yeah, I went and dropped them in here. That's the reason I put the Harvard Business one is because you only get 2 a month, so unless you buy it.
I just wanted to add that in the little that I did watch prior to today, I think you really highlighted the movement in between the spaces, which isn't something that was highlighted in the shorter videos, which I really appreciated. I think as Agilists, as coaches, we often fall into that complex or simple space in helping teams towards solutions. And one thing that this has got me thinking about is, how do we question ourselves in that context to keep ourselves moving back to that complex space for problem solving, and thinking of it in this way, kind of questioning where I am at in any given conversation is a good tool to have. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's important to remember that's where Agile is. It's not about locking things down into a certain thing. It is about solving those complex problems. And we often need to check ourselves, have our mental models started to solidify, or have our underlying structures started to solidify? And are we actually solving complex problems anymore? Or are we now just preaching obvious and complicated problems and trying to be an expert instead of a guide and improving things?
So do you find that putting this in practice is just as simple as saying to the team, okay, guys, where are we? Are we in a complex space? Are we in a chaotic space? And that's kind of to get people kind of thinking in those terms? or where do you think the implementation of this way of approaching problems would be best, I guess, executed?
So one thing is you're actually in all of them at all the times, and it's important to remember that, and to different degrees, right? Like you're not always in chaos and running and going, my mental models are constantly changing. But we have these things where as we're taking in inputs, we're starting to view the world differently. That's just part of living, is seeing the world slightly differently. It's more about making sure the right structures are serving the right purpose. So if we think about the concept of our teams and of our products and our creating of new value for the organization, if that starts to become a complicated problem solving type of endeavor, and we're just locking things down, and this team is only solving this problem, and when it is, all of our life is going to be good, well, we're actually probably setting ourselves up for potential failure in the future. It's one of those things as Agilists, we always need to make sure, are our teams solving complex problems at this point, or are they just solving complicated? But when it comes to solving complex problems, what you're actually doing is you put a bunch of experts in a room together, right? The concept of a team, all the skills you need, put them all in the room together and just say, here's our purpose. What do you need to do? And they're going to bring their past experience and their past behaviors to make a best guess on which direction in the foggy forest they're going to walk first. And then they're going to try to walk in that foggy forest based off of their expertise. But we need to make sure that feedback loop exists, right? That feedback is coming in and their next behavior is going to be informed upon that information. If we put a bunch of experts in a room and just say, build us this thing, and they just go off and build it, and there's no feedback loop and there's no reassessing your situation, and they're just a bunch of experts just going off in a direction, well, we're actually not solving a complex problem anymore. We're just building a feature, and it just requires experts to build that feature.
Hey, Kent, I hate to interrupt. I could
Yeah.
listen to you talk about this all day, but we are a couple minutes over time. So I just want to take one more opportunity to thank you, if for no other reason than Dean will stop saying, hey, what about Kent? What about Kent? What about Kent now? So I really appreciate your time. And if anybody has any comments to add, we do have comments on the board. Again, just a reminder, there's a place for future Agile topics, so add your thoughts there. And with that, I just wanted to say thanks. Thanks for everybody for joining.